Hello. Today we continue the conversation with Anatoly Fomenko about the reflections of Jesus Christ discovered by him and Gleb Nosovsky in historical documents and literary works using their proprietary method of form codes. The Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology in Yaroslavl vividly presents the results of applying this method. In the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology in the hall dedicated to the Epic of Christ, there is a module that explains the method of form codes. In the module, Comparative Biography of Jesus Christ and Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos, on interactive screens, the most significant similarities in their biographies are presented. Also, in this hall, visitors can learn who calculated the date of Christ's birth, and when the modern calendar appeared. Anatoly Timofeyevich, hello.
Hello Svetlana, I'm very glad to see you and our listeners.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, in our previous podcasts, you talked about the main reflections of Jesus Christ that you managed to discover in historical texts. These are the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos and the Russian Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky. However, it turns out that even Andrew the Apostle, also referred to as the first called, is a reflection of Christ as well. Please tell us about your research on this.
According to our reconstruction, and we discovered this using the method of form codes, the famous Saint Andrew, who baptized Russia, is another reflection of Jesus Christ. For most of his life, Andrew the Apostle lived, preached, and ruled in Russia during the 12th century. The next image is the X-shaped cross on which, it is believed, Andrew the Apostle was martyred by crucifixion. Why exactly an X-shaped cross is a non-essential question, but we can suggest a hypothesis. Why was the image of the X-shaped cross associated with Jesus Christ, that is, with Andrew the Apostle? In Christian tradition, there is a famous storyline, the resurrection of Christ and his descent into hell. The Gospels do not mention this, but it is a well-known topic. The theme of Christ's descent into hell is very detailed in early Christian sources. As it is believed, he broke the gates of hell, which were often depicted as an X-shaped cross, on which Jesus Christ stands. He entered hell, defeated the forces of hell, defeated the prince of darkness, defeated Satan, and brought out the righteous. This image of Jesus Christ standing on an X-shaped cross is reflected in the form of the X-shaped cross on which, it is believed, Andrew the Apostle was crucified. The story of Andrew the Apostle is very important for us because, in early Christian tradition, it is believed that Russia was baptized by Andrew the Apostle. It is believed that Saint Andrew arrived in southern Russia by ship, and traveled up a large river, heading towards Rome. It is believed that while on his way to Rome, he baptized Russia. This event took place in Novgorod. Here, we should note that in the traditional version, questions arise about such an itinerary of the Apostle. According to the Scaligerian history, Rome is located in another direction, in Italy. But in our reconstruction, everything falls into place. Andrew the Apostle was heading to Rome. Now we know that the Roman kingdom, ancient Rome, is Novgorod, Yaroslavl on the famous Volga River. Andrew ascended not along the Dnieper, as is believed today, but along the Volga. I will remind you that rivers were previously called by the word Don. Hence, there are many names like Dnieper, Don, Danube, Dniester, all sharing the root Don. The generalized name for rivers is Don. Therefore, as we understand now, going up the Dnieper, Don, the apostle ascended along the Volga, heading to Novgorod, Yaroslavl on the Volga. It is believed that he baptized Novgorod, baptized the people of Novgorod. This is the established early Christian version. However, let's pay attention to the contradictions that immediately arise in the Scaligerian-Romanov history. According to this version, Jesus Christ and Andrew the Apostle lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, and in the Romanov history, it is considered that Novgorod was founded no earlier than the 11th century. How could Andrew the Apostle baptize Russia in the 10th–11th centuries? The official date of the baptism of Russia is considered to be the end of the 10th century, perhaps the beginning of the 11th century. This is even the official Scaligerian-Romanov perspective. Russia was baptized precisely at that time, 1,000 years after the time of Jesus Christ. So, according to traditional history, Russia waited 1,000 years before finally deciding to be baptized. A millennium passed. Of course, this is very strange. In our reconstruction, there is no contradiction. Russia was baptized in the mid-12th century, and it was indeed baptized by Andrei Bogolubsky, also known as Andronikos Komnenos, also known as Andrew the Apostle. Russia did not wait 1,000 years for its baptism. Moreover, I will remind you that in Russian tradition, the Russian czars of the 15th–16th centuries insisted that Russia was baptized personally by Andrew the Apostle. This was a firm standpoint of our church and secular authorities. How did the Scaligerian-Romanov historians handle this vivid millennium-long contradiction in their own scheme? They did it simply. They claimed that the story of the baptism of Russia by Saint Andrew was a late fable, and that indeed, in the 1st century of the Common Era, he arrived in Russia and appeared at the place where Novgorod would be, baptizing local tribes. In connection with this, let's pay attention to a vivid narrative in our tale of bygone years. It says the following about this significant event, about the baptism of Novgorod by Andrew. From there, Andrew went to Rome. He then reached the Slavs at the point where Novgorod is now situated. That is, the word "now" is inserted. Just one word. This cunningly distorts the essence of the events. I repeat, both secular and church traditions declared that Andrew baptized Novgorod. Here, the word "now" is inserted, suggesting that supposedly Novgorod wasn't there yet. Unfortunately, this fits into the overall ideology that envelops the description of the history of the Slavs and the history of ancient Greece and Rome. From school, we are all accustomed to the idea that long before the Common Era, ancient Romans and ancient Greeks reached heights in science, art, military affairs, and statecraft. They already knew that the Earth was a sphere. Ancient Greeks measured the distance from the Earth to the Sun, created the Almagest. Meanwhile, as we are persuaded, in the territory of Russia, including the future territory of Novgorod, wild tribes lived. They dwelled in caves, warmed themselves by fires, spoke in rough sounds. These tribes were very far from the highly developed ancient Greeks and Romans. Therefore, the word now fits into this ideology. However, it must be openly said that although today few people know about it, other Russian sources have been preserved, which are now considered apocryphal. For example, the Rostov Chronicle is an extensive chronicle that in many instances tells the Russian history significantly differently than the tale of bygone years, which, according to our research, was created only in the 18th century during the reign of Peter the Great. It was during that time that the cunning word, now, was inserted. What does the Rostov Chronicle say about the baptism of Russia, i.e. Novgorod, by Andrew the Apostle? The Rostov Chronicle states that the Apostle came to the city of Novgorod, which already existed. Moreover, the Chronicle says that there were many people living there, a large population. The city of Novgorod was the capital, writes the Rostov Chronicle. Besides, it had a large kingdom under its authority. The way of life and laws of Novgorod extended to the population of that entire kingdom. Coming to this city, Andrew the Apostle baptized the people of Novgorod. That is, he baptized the people of the capital that already existed in the place of Novgorod, without any word, now. This is a vivid narrative to remember when discussing the history of Saint Andrew. I repeat that in our reconstruction, everything is in its place. Andrei Boголюбский lived in the 12th century. He ruled in Russia. Therefore, there are no thousand-year gaps. The tortures and crucifixion of Andrew the Apostle strongly overlap with the details of the life of Andronikos Komnenos and Andrei Boголюбский. I won't go into detail about it here. You can read about it in our books. There is a hagiography of Andrew the Apostle where his torture and suffering are vividly described in great detail, with many elements overlapping with the crucifixion of Christ. It is mentioned that the execution of Saint Andrew was public. There was a trial, and he was condemned. According to the hagiography, a multitude of people gathered from everywhere. As in the case of Christ, his clothes were torn off, as described in the Gospels. About 20,000 people gathered around the cross. He was crucified, and his clothes were handed over to the soldiers. In general, if not literally, a very accurate reproduction of the events described in the Gospels.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, I would like to ask you to briefly talk about another very important topic: the reflection of the life of Jesus Christ in ancient Egyptian mythology and culture.
We have already mentioned that Egypt is the ancestral burial place of the royal Horde dynasty, to which Andronikos Christ originally belonged. In Egypt, in its pantheon of gods, the first place is, of course, occupied by the god Osiris. The proximity of the Egyptian god Osiris to Christ is so obvious that many scholars noted it even before us. In the 19th century, a large school of scholars compiled extensive tables, drawing parallels between the life of the god Osiris of ancient Egypt and Jesus Christ. This fact is well known. It was even a medieval Christian tradition, and medieval Christians often identified Osiris with Christ in their writings. This is one of the depictions of the god Osiris. I want to draw attention to the fact that all of Egypt, all the images on tomb walls, monuments, are covered with depictions of the Christian cross. Here is the Christian cross, a cross with a loop for wearing around the neck, a pectoral cross. These crosses fill thousands and thousands of images in Egypt. Here is the Christian cross, another cross, a regular cross without a loop, and so on. Here is the same cross with a loop. This is an image of the goddess Isis with the infant Horus. He's also Christ. Of course, this is indistinguishable from the depiction of the Virgin Mary holding infant Jesus Christ in her arms. Furthermore, what else is reflected in Egyptian mythology? Almost all the biographies of Jesus Christ are reflected, but particularly vividly, the eye, that was damaged and even torn out during the Passions, during the torments of Christ. This is the eye of Horus, meaning the eye of Christ. The images of the eye cover the walls of ancient Egypt. Moreover, often the gods hold this eye in their hands. Here, a god bird holds the torn-out eye of Andronikos Christ in its hands. Egyptian texts also mention that the eye was torn out. Set, Satan, in the Egyptian version, the god Set, is a reflection of the Christian name Satan. He attacked Horus, tore his eyes out of the eye sockets. Here, it is mentioned that 2 eyes were torn out. But later on, in the depictions, only 1 eye is always mentioned. 1 eye of Horus is depicted, not 2 eyes. This narrative was discussed in great detail in ancient Egyptian myths, and it was given great importance. Here are more depictions of the torn-out eye of Christ, aka the eye of Horus in the Egyptian version. Here is another depiction from the Book of the Dead. I repeat, there is a vast number of such images.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, please explain why the era of Andronikos Christ has been pushed back in time by a whole 1,000 years? How did this chronological shift occur?
Let's return to the scheme we were discussing. This is one of the parallelisms identified by the method of dynastic parallelisms, showing how 1,000 years shift in chronology occurred. How a huge error arose, leading to the incorrect dating of many events. At the top is the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, considered to be from the 10th to the 13th centuries. At the bottom is the Roman Empire or the Pax Romana from the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD. Let me remind you why we talked about this. At the top, in the middle of the 12th century, the birth of Andronikos Christ is shown in the year 1152. An erroneous shift of 100 years is shown, which moved this event to the middle of the 11th century, including the supernova explosion from the mid-12th century being placed on paper in the middle of the 11th century. Vertically downward, we see the birth of Andronikos Christ, and here is the explosion of the Gospel Star, also known as the Bethlehem Star. This is the shift of 1,000 years. Let's think about how such shifts could have occurred. There were many reasons why chronologists of the 16th–17th centuries distorted genuine dates and pushed events of the Middle Ages into the distant past by huge intervals, by 300 years, by 1,000 years, by 1,800 years. There were many reasons, but one of the reasons is very understandable, and we will briefly discuss it now. For example, a chronological shift of 1,000, or more precisely, 1,100 years. This is a consequence of an error in dating the life of Jesus Christ. What could be the reason for this? Here's the thing. This fact is known, but it needs to be reminded, as it is not very widely spread. The point is that originally, dates were recorded in the form of expressions, formulas, and letters. These formulas were often subject to abbreviations. Then, the original meaning of this letter abbreviation was forgotten, and later chronologists suggested interpreting these letters not as an abbreviation for names, but as the representation of digits. I'll remind you that letters used to represent numbers as well. Alpha was 1, and so on. Then, by substituting digits for letters, chronologists started to obtain incorrect dates, significantly different from the authentic ones. Since there were several abbreviation formulas, multiple chronological shifts emerged. In other words, each incorrect deciphering of a shortened formula resulted in its own chronological shift. For example, the letter X once represented the name Christ, but then it was declared to be the digit 10. The Latin letter I once denoted the name Jesus, I or J for Jesus, but later it was also declared to represent 1,000. Let's consider the first method of abbreviated notation. For instance, the 3rd century from Christ. I rushed a bit. Just to refresh our memory, let's first take a look at the next illustration. This is an image of Gregory Hildebrand. I'll remind you that this is a reflection, a duplicate of Andronikos Christ, shifted on paper from the 12th century to the 11th century. Pope Gregory VII, also known as Hildebrand. This is a medieval depiction. By the way, pay attention to the bird. It's a dove, the Holy Spirit descending on the Pope. The Holy Spirit was often depicted alongside Christ. Another image of the same Pope Gregory Hildebrand. Again, the Holy Spirit descends on this phantom duplicate of Jesus Christ. Another depiction. This is a later image of Gregory VII Hildebrand. This chronological chart was compiled by me based on application of the methods of the new chronology. Briefly, at the top, the structure of the modern Scaligerian textbook is shown, which we consider today as the foundation of our knowledge of ancient and medieval history. Just below, the discovered division of this textbook into the sum of 4 short chronicles is shown. Here is one chronicle, the second, the third, and the fourth. They are shifted in the past by different amounts. By 300 years, approximately by 1,000 years, by 1,800 years. Now we are discussing the question of why a shift of 1,000 years appeared. Here it is. Let's go back to how dates were recorded. For example, the 3rd century from Christ could be abbreviated as X period 3, where X is the first letter of the word Christ in Greek. By the way, the letter X is one of the most common medieval anagrams for the name of Christ. Therefore, the expression, the 1st century from Christ, in abbreviated notation could take the form, X.1. In the illustration, the 4th century from Christ was denoted as X4, where X was not yet a digit but an abbreviation of the name Christ. Look, an interesting fact is how medieval Italians called centuries, how they denoted them. It is well known that Italians denoted centuries by hundreds. They said trecento, meaning the 300s, which was the 14th century, and quattrocento, meaning the 400s, which was the 15th century, and so on. This is how Italians of the 15th, 16th centuries called them.
3, then 100, 4, then 100.
But such names directly indicate the starting point of counting the years in the 11th century. Otherwise, you can't get trecento in the 14th century. You have to count from the 11th century. In other words, Italians of the 15th, 16th centuries still remembered the correct tradition of dating from the birth of Christ in the 11th or 12th century. I'll remind you that the 11th century was a mistake. They shifted on paper the birth of Christ from the 12th to the 11th century and counted dates upwards from there. Furthermore, the Latin letter, I, also used to represent the name Jesus, and by no means a number, certainly not 1,000. Previously, dates sounded like this: from Jesus, the year 595, which again indicates the starting point in the 11th century, 100 years earlier than it should have been in the 12th century. A period was placed in the date. The period was not placed randomly but rather served to indicate that this was not a digit, but a letter. And then followed the smaller number indicating the actual date. There are a vast number of such date notations. Traveling through Western Europe, you can observe numerous examples of such dates in museums. For instance, take a print by Albrecht Altdorfer. Here, the date is written. Look closely at the enlarged image. Once again, period, 706. Initially, it was expressed as, from Jesus, the year 706. The starting point is in the 11th century, meaning there is no 8,000. Neither the Italians nor those who wrote dates in this manner were aware of the supposed millennium that passed since the birth of Christ. For them, there was no such millennium. Here is a well-known print by Dürer. At the bottom, you can find his monogram and the date. Here it is. Please closely observe. Period, 524. From Jesus, the year 524. Here, the I is written just like a regular I, with a dot. 2 periods were placed, one before and one after. I reiterate, in the past, this was not a digit but a representation of the name Jesus. Here is a print depicting Schwartz, supposedly the inventor of gunpowder. Here is the date, again, I, this time without a period, 380. A print by George Pence. Here is the date in detail, J for Jesus.
Jesus, the year 548. Here is, Jesus, the year 679. In detail, Jesus, the year 679.
From Jesus, the year 603, this is Germany. Such date notations were used up until the 18th century, and it was a common form, even in the 18th century.
Here is an old painting, I, or J, 755.
The next thought, dates were written like this, M, period, D, period, followed by some smaller number, in this case, 28, written in Roman numerals. Today, We are told that M is 1000, D is 500, resulting in the year 1528, but as we understand now, it was not like that before. These were abbreviations. For such an abbreviation, many interpretations are possible. For example, M could be an abbreviation for the word Magnus or Megas, meaning great or greatest, and D could be an abbreviation for the word Deus, meaning God, or Dome, meaning royal house or ruling house. In other words, it could signify, for instance, 28 years from some great house or 28 years from a great deity. There is a vast number of such dates. Here are periods M, D, indicate that they were given a different meaning than today. Here is again M, period, D, followed by a smaller date. Here is again I, period, 593, and below, M and D are written, interestingly enough, with crescent moons. M is 2 crescent moons, on the left and on the right, and D is I, with a crescent moon on the right. I will quickly flip through numerous dates from museums in Western Europe. J, then a smaller date. Jesus, 703.
Jesus, 660. Jesus, 580.
Jesus, 708. Here is an interesting one, from Germany, an ancient castle.
Date, I, 577.
There is no period here. The period is placed directly on the I. This is letter I, and the period was moved to the center. Again, they still remembered the correct tradition that it was not a digit. It was the letter I. An abbreviation for the name of Christ. There it is. I, from Jesus, and then a smaller date.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, let's remind our viewers of the main reflections of Jesus Christ that you discovered in historical documents and literary works.
To date, we have discovered more than 124 phantom reflections of Andronikos Christ, Andronikos Komnenos, also known as our Prince Andrei Bogolubsky, and also Andrew the Apostle on the pages of Scaligerian history.
On the left are listed numerous names, more than 100 of them. On the right, the time of real life is marked, 1152 to 1185.
Here, bold dots indicate the erroneous dates in the past to which the phantom duplicates of Andrei Bogolubsky were projected. It can be seen that these dates have spread over vast distances. Here, we are already in the -7th century, -8th, -14th century. That's monstrously ancient. As a summary, we have a table listing the phantom reflections we have found. There are many of them. I won't read them all. I'll just highlight a few storylines. Alongside respectful and reverential reflections, such as the god Osiris, there are opposite reflections that emerged during the Reformation era when a fierce struggle began against the Horde Empire and its religion, Christianity. For example, the famous character Faust. As we have discovered, and there is our book on this topic, it is a skeptical, even mocking parody of Andronikos Christ. Till Eulenspiegel, a well-known trickster and jester supposedly from the 14th–16th centuries in Germany. This is also a skeptical, mocking parody of Andronikos Christ. There are others, which I will skip. At the bottom, numerous reflections of Andronikos Christ appear as the kings of the Inca Empire in Peru, in America. There are many, several reflections of somehow famous kings in Inca history. Viracocha, Inca Roca. Here is Gregory Hildebrand, as we mentioned earlier. This reflection is shifted down on paper by 100 years. Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. One should not think that Shakespeare's tragedy is the primary source. Not at all. The biography of Hamlet is from the Saga of Hamlet by Saxo Grammaticus from the 12th century. Shakespeare simply reworked it, greatly simplified it, and wrote his famous tragedy. The description of Hamlet in Saxo Grammaticus's saga is a vivid duplicate of the biography of Andrzej Bogolyubski. Next, Macduff in the Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth. In Russian history, this is the Russian hero Svidogor. On this topic, you can check our book on Russian epic poems. By the way, there is a lot of material about these duplicates in our Museum of the New Chronology in Yaroslavl. In Roman history, there are many reflections of Andronikos Christ. Here are Roman rulers, emperors Heliogabalus, Commodus, II alias Verus, Hadrian. A partial duplicate Domitian. Not only kings and rulers. Euclid. In texts that talk about Euclid, there are very vivid parallels with the biography of Andronikos Christ. The Greek philosopher and sage Socrates. In ancient Greek history, there are many reflections, including famous ones like Alcibiades, Miltiades. It turns out that there are also a lot of reflections of Andronikos Christ in the history of Iran, Persia, in the famous epic Shahnameh. He is called by different names there. Famous kings of ancient Iran: Kiamars, Mardaz, Jamshid, Faridun, Rostam or Rustam, Khosrow, and so on. Furthermore, in the history of the Etruscans, Servius Tullius is considered an Etruscan king in the ancient history of Rome. In ancient Greek history, Jason, gods, demigods, Asclepius, Hercules or Heracles. In the Bible, a partial duplicate is the well-known patriarch Jacob. By the way, Gulliver. In the early 18th century, the writer Jonathan Swift periodically reworked the life story of Hercules Christ and created the well-known character Gulliver. Today, few people read Swift's original text. If one looks closely, this parallel emerges very vividly. Those interested can refer to our book, where this mockery of Andronikos Christ is vividly demonstrated. Swift's books, stories about Till Eulenspiegel, stories about Faust, these were a kind of dissident literature of the 17th–18th centuries, when reformers fought against the empire, its culture, and religion. They were dissidents of that time. In a slightly veiled form, they ridiculed the foundations of religion, mocked Christ, made fun of him. Later, these books were declared wonderful works that should be studied in schools and universities. At the same time, they disguised the mocking essence and declared that it had no relation to the true history. We are in no way mocking Andronikos Christ here. We are just describing a certain Gulliver who travels through kingdoms. In one kingdom, he is great, in another kingdom, he is small. This is like children's literature. Here are 124 duplicates. The conclusion with which we will conclude our story is that the restored biography of Andronikos Christ, that is, Andrzej Bogolyubski, is enriched with many new and interesting episodes. Early historians mistakenly attributed them to completely different personalities and placed them in a deep phantom past. Therefore, today we can use all these duplicates to recreate a more detailed, more event-filled history of the mid-12th century.
Anatoly Timofeyevich, thank you very much for the detailed and interesting story on such an important topic.
Thank you, Svetlana, for this podcast, and thanks to all the listeners who visited us here today. All the best to everyone.
Goodbye.
In a week, we will continue the conversation with the founders of the new chronology about the results of their scientific research. We look forward to seeing you on our channel and at the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology at 45 Volskaya Embankment, Yaroslavl.